The unopened letter was clutched tightly in Delilah Garner's trembling hands as she stared at the railway platform, the clock ticking past the expected arrival time of the Frontier Mail. 3 hours late, and still no sign of the train or the man she'd been exchanging letters with for nearly a year. The wind whipped across the empty platform of Circleville, Utah Territory, carrying dust and broken promises on an unseasonably cold April day in 1879. Delilah adjusted her bonnet and smoothed her skirts, refusing to admit defeat even as the station master shot her another pitying glance. At 22, she had moved west from Boston following her parents' deaths, hoping to find purpose as the new schoolteacher. What she hadn't expected was to find herself waiting for a stranger whose words had somehow captured her heart through ink and paper. "Miss Garner," the station master called, his voice carrying across the empty platform. "Just got a telegram. Train's delayed another day at least. Rockslide near Cedar City. They're working to clear it, but—" He trailed off, his expression apologetic. Delilah nodded, swallowing her disappointment. The packet of letters from Wyatt Evans, cattle driver and occasional courier for the Postal Service, weighed heavily in her reticule. Their correspondence had begun by accident when he'd delivered a late package to the schoolhouse, and they'd struck up a conversation about literature. One letter had turned into dozens, and when he mentioned he would be passing through Circleville, her heart had leapt at the chance to finally meet him. As she turned to leave, the station master called out again. "Miss Garner, nearly forgot. This came for you this morning." He extended his hand, offering a small, folded piece of paper. Delilah unfolded the rough parchment, her heart quickening as she recognized the bold, slanted handwriting. "Delayed on the trail. Meet me tonight at Harper's Ridge, Sunset. I'll be waiting. W.E." The note was simple, direct, like the man himself, or at least how she imagined him to be. Wyatt Evans had never been one for flowery language, preferring straightforward honesty in his correspondence. It was one of the things she admired about him. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the note to her chest as she hurried from the station, mind racing. Harper's Ridge was only a mile outside of town, but propriety dictated she shouldn't meet a man alone, especially not at sunset. Yet the thought of waiting another day seemed unbearable. The schoolhouse was empty when she arrived, her students having been dismissed hours earlier. Delilah moved to her small desk, pulling out the latest letter she had received from Wyatt 3 weeks ago. "The cattle drive ends soon, and I find myself thinking of our meeting more than is probably wise for a man whose hands are better suited to ropes than writing paper. I've read Walden as you suggested. Thoreau understands something about solitude that speaks to me, though I admit I prefer your words to his. Is it strange to say I feel I know you, though we've never met? Perhaps that's the power of honest words between two people who have nothing to hide and everything to discover." Delilah ran her fingers over the words, feeling the indentations where his pen had pressed into the paper. Decision made, she gathered her things and headed to her small rented room behind the mercantile to prepare. Tonight, she would meet the man whose words had become as essential to her as breath itself. The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. Delilah changed her dress twice, finally settling on a blue calico that brought out her eyes. She pinned her auburn hair carefully, allowing a few curls to frame her face, and dabbed a touch of rose water at her wrists and throat. The looking glass reflected a woman both hopeful and terrified, her green eyes wide with anticipation. As the sun began its descent, Delilah slipped away from town, following the well-worn trail toward Harper's Ridge. The landscape opened before her, vast and beautiful, bathed in the golden light of approaching evening. The ridge overlooked a valley scattered with wildflowers and framed by distant mountains. It was the perfect place for a first meeting open, visible from a distance, yet private enough for conversation. Her heart thundered as she climbed the gentle slope. What if he was disappointed? What if the connection they'd found through letters disappeared when faced with the reality of each other? What if she froze at the crest of the ridge? A horse was tethered to a gnarled juniper tree, and beside it, a tall figure stood watching the sunset. His back was to her, broad shoulders silhouetted against the blazing sky, hat in hand. "Mr. Evans?" she called, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. He turned, and Delilah's breath caught. Wyatt Evans was not what she had expected. His face was more weathered than his 30 years might suggest, tanned from endless days in the sun. His dark hair fell in waves, slightly too long, and his eyes, a startling blue, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "Miss Garner," he said, his voice deeper than she'd imagined, with a slight rasp that suggested he didn't use it often. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." Delilah took a step forward, suddenly aware of how alone they were. "Your note was quite unexpected." "When the train was delayed, I thought." "The train's carrying mail, not me," he said, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I rode ahead, couldn't wait another day." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Delilah felt her cheeks warm. "I brought you something," Wyatt said, reaching into his saddlebag. He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It's not much, but—" Delilah accepted the package, their fingers brushing momentarily. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather-bound copy of Little Women. "You mentioned yours was falling apart," he explained, shifting his weight. "Found this in a bookshop in Denver. The seller claimed it was new, but I think he was stretching the truth a bit." "It's perfect," Delilah whispered, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Truly thank you." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken questions. They had shared their thoughts, dreams, and histories through letters, but standing face to face created a new kind of intimacy that both thrilled and terrified Delilah. "I should apologize," Wyatt finally said, looking down at his hat, which he was turning in his hands. "It wasn't proper to ask you to meet me like this, but after all those letters." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I needed to see if you were real." Delilah laughed softly. "I had the same thought. Sometimes I wondered if you might be a figment of my imagination." A perfect correspondent, appearing just when I was most alone. "Perfect," Wyatt's eyebrow arched. "I think my spelling might disagree with that assessment." "Your spelling has improved considerably," she replied with a teasing smile, "though your handwriting remains a challenge." He laughed then, a rich sound that seemed to warm the cooling evening air. "I've been practicing. Didn't want to embarrass myself in front of the schoolteacher." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in dramatic strokes of orange and purple, they found themselves sitting side by side on a flat rock, talking as easily as they had in their letters. Wyatt told her about the cattle drive, the characters he'd met along the way, and the landscapes he'd traversed. Delilah shared stories about her students, the town's quirks, and her plans for the school's future. "Why Circleville?" Wyatt asked eventually. "Your letters mentioned Boston." "This must seem quite the change." Delilah gazed out at the darkening valley. "After my parents died, there was nothing keeping me there. I needed to go somewhere where I could be useful, where I could build something. The advertisement for a teacher seemed like Providence." She glanced at him. "And your letters never quite explained how a cattle driver became a mail courier." Wyatt's expression grew thoughtful. "Started with a favor for a friend, then became a way to see more of the country without being tied to one place." He paused. "Truth is, I've never been good at staying put. Always felt like I was looking for something I couldn't name." The vulnerability in his admission touched her. "And have you found it?" she asked softly. His eyes met hers, steady and searching. "I'm beginning to think I might have." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Wyatt glanced at the darkening sky and stood abruptly. "I should get you back to town. It's getting late and people will talk." Reality crashed back. Delilah nodded, gathering her shawl and the precious book. "Yes, of course." "That would be wise." He offered his hand to help her up, and she took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. He didn't release her hand immediately, and she didn't pull away. "I'll be in Circleville for a few days," he said. "The cattle are grazing in the south pasture until I can move them to their summer range. Perhaps I could call on you properly tomorrow, with the permission of whoever stands as your guardian here," Delilah smiled. "I have no guardian, Mr. Evans. I'm quite independent. But you may call on me at the schoolhouse after classes end if you wish. Around 3 o'clock. "I wish," he said simply, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch again. The ride back to town was quiet but comfortable. Delilah perched in front of Wyatt on his horse, acutely aware of his solid presence behind her, his arms reaching around to hold the reins. He stopped at the edge of town, allowing her to dismount and walk the remaining distance to preserve her reputation. "Until tomorrow, Miss Garner," he said, tipping his hat. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Evans," she replied, clutching her book to her chest as she watched him ride away, disappearing into the night. Delilah barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of their meeting. By morning, she had convinced herself that he couldn't possibly be as perfect as he had seemed in the golden light of sunset. By noon, she was certain he wouldn't come. By 2, she was watching the clock with such intensity that her students noticed, giggling behind their slates. When the school bell rang at 3, she dismissed the children with uncharacteristic haste. Alone in the schoolhouse, she straightened papers, adjusted books, and fussed with her hair. At 10 minutes past 3, her heart sank. At 15:15, she began gathering her things, telling herself it was for the best. At 20 past, the door opened. Wyatt stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking somewhat chagrined. "Forgive me for being late," he said. "Had a situation with one of the cattle that needed attention." Relief flooded through her. "Of course, you're here now." He stepped inside, looking around the simple schoolroom with interest. "So this is where you shape young minds." "I try," she replied, suddenly shy. In daylight, he was even more handsome than she remembered, his features sharp and defined, his presence filling the small room. "Though some days I wonder who's teaching whom." Wyatt chuckled, moving to examine the books on her desk. "I've been thinking about what you wrote in your last letter about education being the great equalizer. It's a fine notion." "You disagree?" she asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "Not disagree, just wondering if it's enough. Some advantages run deeper than knowing your letters or sums." Delilah moved to stand beside him. "That's why the rest matters too, teaching kindness, fairness, the value of hard work. Those lessons level the field as much as any book learning." He studied her face. "You believe that? It's not just something pretty to say?" "I do," she replied firmly. "I've seen it happen, even in the short time I've been teaching here." Wyatt nodded slowly. "I brought something else for you," he said, reaching into his vest pocket. He withdrew a small, flat stone, smoothed by water and time, with delicate striations of red and orange running through it. "I found it by a river in Arizona Territory," he explained as he placed it in her palm. "The colors reminded me of your description of autumn in Boston." Delilah ran her thumb over the stone's surface, touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful, thank you." "It's nothing valuable," he said quickly. "Just something I thought you might appreciate." "I do," she assured him, meeting his gaze. "Very much." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Wyatt cleared his throat. "I wondered if you might show me around Circleville. Since I'll be here a few days, I should get to know the place." "I'd be delighted," Delilah replied, tucking the stone into her pocket. "Though I should warn you, it won't take long. Circleville isn't exactly bustling." They spent the remainder of the afternoon walking through town, Delilah pointing out the mercantile, the small church, the blacksmith shop, and the few other establishments that made up Circleville's modest center. Wyatt greeted each person they encountered with respectful politeness, and Delilah couldn't help noticing the curious glances they received. "I believe we've become the subject of local interest," she murmured as they passed a group of women who immediately began whispering behind their hands. "Does that bother you?" Wyatt asked, his expression concerned. Delilah considered the question. "No," she decided. "Though I suspect I'll face quite the interrogation from Mrs. Prescott tomorrow. She considers herself the town's moral guardian. And what will you tell her?" "The truth," Delilah replied simply. "That you're a friend I've been corresponding with and you're in town on business." Wyatt's expression shifted slightly. "Just a friend?" The question hung between them, loaded with potential. Delilah felt her cheeks warm. "For now," she said softly. "Though I find myself hoping for more." The admission surprised even her with its boldness, but the smile that spread across Wyatt's face was worth any impropriety. "As do I, Miss Garner, as do I." They ended their tour at the small restaurant that served as Circleville's only dining establishment, sharing a simple meal as the day faded into evening. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on books they'd both read, places Wyatt had traveled, and Delilah's experiences adapting to Western life. "It must have been quite an adjustment," Wyatt observed as they finished their apple pie. "Boston to Circleville is quite the leap." "It was terrifying at first," she admitted. "The journey alone was harrowing. Then arriving to find the schoolhouse in disrepair, half the promised supplies missing, and the children," she laughed. "Let's just say their education had been somewhat neglected. Yet you stayed." "I stayed," she confirmed. "There's something about this place, the land, the people, the sense of building something meaningful. It gets under your skin." Wyatt nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's the West for you, harsh and beautiful all at once." As they left the restaurant, the evening had fully settled, stars appearing in the velvet sky above. Wyatt walked Delilah to her lodgings, their pace deliberately slow, neither wanting the evening to end. "Will you be at the schoolhouse tomorrow?" he asked as they reached her door. "Yes, though it's Saturday, so no classes. I'll be preparing lessons and grading papers." She hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to join me if you'd like. I could use the company." "I'd like that very much," he replied, his voice low. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and intimate. "Good night, Delilah." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent a thrill through her. "Good night, Wyatt." She watched him walk away, his figure tall and straight in the moonlight, before slipping inside, her heart full of emotions she scarcely dared name. The next 3 days fell into a pattern that felt both new and familiar. Wyatt would tend to his cattle in the morning, then join Delilah at the schoolhouse or accompany her on errands around town. They talked endlessly, discovering that the connection they had found through letters translated perfectly to their time together in person. Each evening, he would walk her home, the goodbye at her door growing increasingly difficult. On the 4th day, as they sat together on the schoolhouse steps during the lunch hour, Wyatt broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "I need to move the herd soon," he said, watching a hawk circle overhead. 2 days at most." Delilah nodded, feeling a weight settle in her chest. "I understand. Your work must continue." "It's more than work," he said quietly. "It's a commitment I made, and there are people depending on me to fulfill it." "Of course," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "When will you return to this area?" Wyatt was silent for a long moment. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you." "The cattle are bound for Wyoming territory. It's a long drive, and afterwards." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Afterwards, I've been offered a position managing a ranch near Cheyenne. Good pay, steady work, a place to call home." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Delilah said, forcing a smile. "I'm happy for you. Are you?" he asked, studying her face. "Because I've been thinking about declining." Delilah's breath caught. "Why would you do that?" Wyatt reached for her hand, enfolding it in his. "Because in all my travels, I've never found a reason to stay in one place. Until now." The implication of his words made her heart race. "Wyatt, I wouldn't ask you to give up an opportunity like that. We've known each other in person for only a few days." And through letters for almost a year, he reminded her. I know my own mind, Delilah, and my heart. He squeezed her hand gently, but I understand if you need more time. Delilah looked down at their joined hands, then back at his earnest face. What are you proposing exactly? I'm proposing. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm proposing that I complete this drive, settle my affairs, and return to Circleville by summer's end, to court you properly with the intention of building a future together, if you'll have me. The sincerity in his voice, the hope in his eyes, it was everything Delilah had dreamed of and more, yet she hesitated, practical concerns surfacing. And what then? Would you stay here? There's no ranch to manage in Circleville. There's land to be had, Wyatt replied. Good grazing land. I've saved enough to make a start. Or, he hesitated. Or we could go to Wyoming together. The position comes with a house, a proper one, not just a cabin. The town nearby has a school that needs teachers. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Leave Circleville. The community she'd begun to build, yet the thought of a life with Wyatt, of building something together. I don't need an answer now, he said gently, reading her conflicted expression. Just a promise that you'll consider it. Delilah nodded slowly. I will, I promise. The remainder of the day passed in a strange mixture of joy and melancholy. Every moment with Wyatt now felt precious, knowing their time was limited. When evening came, he suggested they return to Harper's Ridge to watch the sunset, as they had on their first night. The ridge was bathed in the same golden light, the view as spectacular as Delilah remembered. They sat side by side on the same flat rock, but this time Wyatt's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him. I'll write to you every week, he promised, as the sun began its descent. And I'll send telegrams when I can to let you know I'm safe. And I'll reply to every letter, she said, trying to keep her voice light. Perhaps by the time you return, your handwriting will have improved even more. Wyatt chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. I'll practice diligently, schoolteacher. As the last rays of sunlight painted the landscape in amber and gold, he turned to her, his expression serious. May I kiss you, Delilah? I've been wanting to since the moment I saw you standing on this ridge. Her heart hammering, Delilah nodded. Yes, she whispered. Wyatt's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as he leaned forward. The first brush of his lips against hers was soft, questioning. Then, as she responded, the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, a promise of all that might be. Delilah's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing unevenly. Wyatt rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I've never felt this way before, he murmured. It scares me a little. Me too, she admitted. It's like standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. He pulled back slightly to look at her, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. But wonderful too, isn't it? Delilah smiled, her heart full. Yes, wonderful. They remained on the ridge until the stars emerged, talking of possibilities, dreams, and the future they might build together. When they finally returned to town, their goodbye at Delilah's door was long and tender, filled with promises and one more lingering kiss. The next morning brought reality crashing back as Wyatt prepared to leave with his herd. Delilah met him at the edge of town, determined to be brave. Remember your promise, he said, holding her hands in his. Consider what I've proposed. I'll return by summer's end, sooner if I can manage it. I'll be waiting, she replied, fighting back tears. Be safe, Wyatt. He kissed her once more, then mounted his horse. This isn't goodbye, he said firmly. It's just until we meet again. Delilah watched him ride away, leading his cattle north until he was just a speck on the horizon. Only then did she allow her tears to fall, not of sadness, but of hope, of possibility, of a future suddenly filled with promise. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of routine and anticipation. Delilah threw herself into her teaching, expanding the curriculum and organizing a small library for the town with books donated by Eastern benefactors. True to his word, Wyatt wrote regularly, his letters arriving like clockwork every Thursday on the Frontier Mail. His early letters detailed the cattle, drive the challenges of river crossings, the beauty of the landscape, the characters among his hired hands. As the weeks turned to months, his correspondence shifted to his preparations for their future. He had accepted the ranch manager position conditionally, negotiating terms that would allow him to return to Circleville first. "The ranch owner, Mr. Henderson, is a reasonable man," he wrote in late June. "He understands matters of the heart, having traveled across the country himself to court his wife. The position will remain open until autumn, giving us time to decide our path together. The thought of that decision of having a future to plan with you makes the long days and longer nights bearable." Delilah read each letter dozens of times, tracing the increasingly neat handwriting, smiling at his evident practice. Her replies were equally devoted, sharing the daily life of Circleville, her hopes for their future, and the growing certainty in her heart about what she wanted. Summer in Utah Territory brought scorching heat and occasional violent thunderstorms. On one such evening in early August, Delilah was grading papers in her room when a frantic knocking came at her door. She opened it to find Tommy Fletcher, one of her students, soaking wet and breathless. "Miss Garner, Pa says to come quick. The creek's rising fast and Mr. Miller's place is flooding. Everyone's helping sandbag." Without hesitation, Delilah grabbed her shawl and followed the boy into the downpour. The normally docile creek that ran along the edge of town had transformed into a raging torrent, threatening the Miller farm and several other properties. The entire town had turned out, forming a chain to pass sandbags along the bank. For hours, they worked in the driving rain, fighting to contain the water. Delilah's arms ached, her dress was soaked through, but she kept going, drawing on a strength she hadn't known she possessed. When the storm finally passed near dawn, the exhausted townspeople surveyed their work with grim satisfaction. The worst of the flooding had been contained, though the Miller barn had been partially washed away. "Never seen the creek rise so fast," Mr. Fletcher commented as they trudged back toward town. "Lucky we all pulled together." Delilah nodded, too tired for words. The crisis had revealed something important to her: the depth of her connection to this community, to these people who had become her extended family. As she collapsed into bed, her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Wyatt and the decision that had been crystallizing in her mind. 2 days later, a telegram arrived from Cheyenne. "Arrived safely. Stop. Job secure. Stop returning to you within fortnight. Stop counting the days. Stop." Wyatt. Delilah pressed the telegram to her heart, excitement building. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, he would return, and they would begin their future together, a future she now knew with certainty would be here in Circleville, where both of them had found something worth staying for. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Delilah cleaned her small room obsessively, finished grading all outstanding papers, and even bought a new dress from the Mercantile, a deep green that brought out her eyes, more fashionable than her usual practical attire. Then, just as her anticipation reached its peak, another telegram arrived. "Frontier Mail delayed. Stop. Rockslide blocking tracks. Stop. Will find alternative route. Stop. Wait for me. Stop." Wyatt. Disappointment washed over her, followed quickly by concern. Alternative route could mean many things, some of them dangerous. The territories between Wyoming and Utah were vast and often treacherous, particularly for a man traveling alone. 3 days passed with no word. Delilah tried to maintain her routine, but found herself constantly distracted, watching the road into town, starting at every sound of hoofbeats. On the 4th day, she was at the schoolhouse preparing for the fall term when Mrs. Prescott burst in, face flushed with excitement. "A rider just came through town," she announced without preamble. "Says there was trouble on the North Trail, outlaws robbing travelers. 3 men hurt, one of them badly. They're bringing them to town now." Delilah's blood ran cold. "Did he say who was hurt?" Mrs. Prescott shook her head. No names, just that they found them near Foster's Crossing. Dr. Simmons is preparing for them now. The next hour was the longest of Delilah's life. She paced the schoolhouse, torn between rushing to the doctor's office and maintaining her composure. When she finally heard the commotion of wagons arriving in town, she could wait no longer. The scene outside Dr. Simmons' office was chaotic. Townspeople gathered, horses being tended, men carrying stretchers inside. Delilah pushed her way through, heart in her throat, searching for any sign of Wyatt. "Miss Garner," Dr. Simmons called, spotting her in the doorway. "Good, we could use an extra pair of hands. Can you clean and bandage while I attend to the worst case?" "Of course," Delilah replied automatically, scanning the room. 2 men sat on chairs, being tended by Mrs. Simmons. A third lay on the examination table, a crowd of people around him blocking her view. She moved to help the nearest man, a grizzled older fellow with a gash on his arm. As she cleaned the wound, she asked as calmly as she could, "What happened?" "Ambush," he grunted. 5 miles north of Foster's Crossing. 4 men with bandanas covering their faces wanted our horses and valuables. Wasn't going to be a problem, we were outnumbered, but then that fool over there, he jerked his head toward the examination table, decided to play hero when they started roughing up the old man. Delilah's hands trembled slightly. This man who intervened, what did he look like? The older man squinted at her. Tall fella, dark hair, riding a big chestnut horse, knew how to handle himself too, took down 2 of the bandits before the third shot him. The room seemed to spin. Delilah finished bandaging his arm on autopilot, then moved toward the examination table, dread building with each step. The crowd had thinned, allowing her to see the pale face of the injured man. Wyatt lay motionless, his shirt cut away. Dr. Simmons working efficiently to extract a bullet from his shoulder. His face was bruised, a cut above his eye crusted with dried blood, but it was undeniably him. "Wyatt," she whispered, rushing forward. Dr. Simmons glanced up. "You know this man?" "Yes," Delilah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. He's my fiancé." The word came out naturally, though no formal engagement existed between them. In that moment, faced with the possibility of losing him, technicalities seemed meaningless. "Well, your fiancé is lucky, Doctor," Simmons said, dropping the extracted bullet into a basin with a clink. "The bullet missed anything vital. He's lost blood, and there's risk of infection, but with proper care he should recover." Relief washed over her so intensely that Delilah had to grip the edge of the table to remain standing. "Thank God," she murmured. "He'll need constant attention for the next few days," Dr. Simmons continued. "Clean bandages, cool compresses for the fever that will likely develop. My wife and I can't manage it alone, not with the other patients." "I'll care for him," Delilah said immediately. "Just tell me what to do." Dr. Simmons studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. We'll move him to the back room once I've finished here. Mrs. Prescott can chaperone, I'm sure." The next 3 days were a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Wyatt developed a fever as predicted, thrashing in delirium, sometimes calling out Delilah's name, other times shouting warnings to unseen companions. She barely left his side, sponging his burning forehead, changing bandages, coaxing water between his cracked lips. Mrs. Prescott, true to form, appointed herself guardian of propriety, sitting in the corner with her knitting, occasionally offering advice or relief so Delilah could rest. To Delilah's surprise, the older woman was kind rather than judgmental, her sharp eyes softening when she observed the tenderness with which Delilah cared for Wyatt. "He must be a good man," Mrs. Prescott remarked on the second evening as Delilah gently combed Wyatt's tangled hair away from his face. "To inspire such devotion." "The best I've known," Delilah replied softly. "He was coming back to me when this happened, coming back to build a life together." Mrs. Prescott nodded thoughtfully. "Then he will fight to return to you. The good Lord doesn't bring two people together across such distances only to separate them so soon. On the morning of the fourth day, Delilah had dozed off in the chair beside Wyatt's bed, her hand still clasping his. She awoke to the sensation of his fingers tightening around hers and opened her eyes to find him watching her, his gaze clear for the first time since his arrival. "You're here," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. Tears sprang to her eyes. "Of course I'm here. Where else would I be?" Wyatt's lips curved into a weak smile. "Thought I might be dreaming, had a lot of dreams about you these past days." Delilah brought his hand to her lips, kissing his knuckles. "Not a dream. You're in Circleville at Dr. Simmons' house. You were shot, but you're going to be fine." His brow furrowed as memory returned. "The others, the old man, all safe," she assured him. "Thanks to you, though it was a foolish risk to take." "Couldn't stand by," he murmured, then winced as he tried to shift position. "Don't move," Delilah cautioned. "Your shoulder needs time to heal." Wyatt's eyes never left her face, drinking her in as if memorizing every feature. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Tired, but beautiful." Delilah gave a watery laugh. "I look a fright, and you know it. I haven't properly slept in days." "Because of me," he said, regret crossing his features. "I'm sorry, Delilah. This isn't how I planned our reunion." "Hush," she said, smoothing his hair back. "You're alive and you're here. That's all that matters." Mrs. Prescott cleared her throat from the doorway. "I see our patient is awake," she said, entering with a tray of broth and tea. Excellent timing. Miss Garner was beginning to worry us all with her vigilance. Wyatt's eyebrow raised slightly at the older woman's presence. Delilah explained quickly, "Mrs. Prescott has been our chaperone. Dr. Simmons insisted for propriety's sake." "And a good thing, too, Mrs." Prescott said briskly, setting down the tray. "Though I must say, Miss Garner has been the model of proper behavior, despite her obvious concern for your welfare." She fixed Wyatt with a penetrating stare. "You have found yourself an exceptional young woman, Mr. Evans." "I trust you intend to honor that properly." "Yes, madam," Wyatt replied, a hint of amusement in his tired eyes. "As soon as I can stand without assistance, that's precisely my intention." Recovery was slow and frustrating for Wyatt, who chafed at the confinement and his own weakness. By the end of the week, he was able to sit up and take short walks around the room. By the following Wednesday, Dr. Simmons pronounced him well enough to leave his care, though he would need several more weeks before his shoulder healed completely. The question of where Wyatt would stay during his convalescence was solved by Mr. Fletcher, who offered the use of a small cabin on his property in exchange for Wyatt's expertise in horse training once he recovered. The arrangement was perfect, close enough to town for Delilah to visit daily, yet separate enough to quiet any gossip. Their courtship resumed under these unusual circumstances, with Delilah visiting each afternoon after school, bringing books to read aloud, news from town, and home-cooked meals. As Wyatt's strength returned, they were able to take short walks, his arm linked with hers for support, gradually venturing further from the cabin each day. It was during one such walk, nearly a month after the shooting, that Wyatt broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "I received a letter from Mr. Henderson yesterday," he said as they followed a path along the creek, now calm and peaceful after the summer storms. "He's extended the offer until spring, given the circumstances." Delilah nodded, her heart quickening. "And what did you tell him?" Wyatt stopped, turning to face her. "I told him I would discuss it with you, that my future plans depended entirely on what would make you happy." "My happiness?" Delilah repeated, surprise coloring her voice. "Yes," Wyatt said simply. "I've had a lot of time to think these past weeks, Delilah. I came back to Circleville convinced I knew what was best for us, a fresh start in Wyoming, away from this small town with limited opportunities." He took her hands in his gaze intense. "But then, I saw how everyone here rallied around you when I was injured, how they respect you, care for you. This community is your family now. I can't ask you to leave that." Delilah felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by his consideration. And what about your opportunity? The ranch management position? Wyatt shrugged his good shoulder. There are opportunities here, too. Mr. Fletcher mentioned that old Johnson is looking to sell his grazing land. It's not as grand as Henderson's ranch, but it's a start. We could build something over time. You would do that? Delilah asked softly. Stay here, start smaller for me. I would do anything for you, he replied, his voice low and serious. These weeks have shown me what truly matters. Not the size of the ranch or the prestige of the position, but having someone to come home to, someone to build a life with. That someone is you, Delilah. The where of it is secondary. Overcome with emotion, Delilah stepped closer, framing his face with her hands. I love you, Wyatt Evans, more than I thought possible. Joy blazed across his features. And I love you, Delilah Garner, enough to put down roots at last. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. I've been carrying this since Denver, he explained, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. It's not fancy, it's perfect, Delilah interrupted, her heart feeling too large for her chest. Wyatt took her left hand, his eyes never leaving hers. Delilah Garner, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in Circleville, teach our children to read and ride, grow old with me under these Utah skies? Yes, she whispered, tears flowing freely now. Yes to all of it. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close with his good arm, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all the days and years to come. They were married 3 weeks later in Circleville's small church, the entire town turning out for the occasion. Mrs. Prescott had taken charge of the arrangements, ensuring that, despite its simplicity, the wedding was as proper and beautiful as any Boston society affair. Delilah wore a cream-colored dress ordered specially from Salt Lake City, carrying wildflowers gathered by her students that morning. Wyatt, his arm still in a sling but otherwise recovered, looked handsome and slightly overwhelmed in a new suit, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice their number. As twilight fell, the newlyweds slipped away to the cabin that would be their temporary home until they could build on the land Wyatt had purchased Johnson's grazing acreage, with a creek running through it and a view of the mountains that took Delilah's breath away. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and passionate, both of them discovering each other with wonder and joy. As they lay together afterward, Wyatt tracing patterns on Delilah's bare shoulder, he asked, Are you happy, Mrs. Evans? Delilah smiled at the new name, still unfamiliar but already precious. Completely, she assured him, resting her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. No regrets about Wyoming, about the bigger opportunity. She propped herself up to look into his eyes. None. This is where we belong, together. 5 years later, the Frontier Mail was running late again. Delilah Evans stood on the platform of Circleville's expanded train station, 3-year-old Thomas squirming in her arms while 5-year-old Eleanor held tightly to her skirt. When's the train coming, Mama? Eleanor asked for the dozenth time, her dark hair so like her father's escaping from its ribbons. Soon, sweetheart, Delilah replied patiently. Remember, trains sometimes run behind schedule, like Papa when he goes to check the far pasture. Thomas asked, his green eyes her eyes wide with understanding. Delilah laughed. Exactly like that. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn. Wyatt approached on horseback, looking every inch the successful rancher he had become. The years had been good to him. His face was more weathered, perhaps, a few strands of silver appearing at his temples, but his smile when he saw his family was as bright as ever. Thought I'd find you here, he said, dismounting and lifting Eleanor for a hug. Any sign of it yet? None, Delilah replied, accepting his quick kiss. Though Mr. Peterson says the Telegraph reported it left Cedar City this morning, so it shouldn't be much longer. Wyatt nodded, taking Thomas from her arms. And how are my deputies today, helping Mama with her important mission? Both children nodded solemnly. They understood, In their limited way, the importance of what their mother had organized a lending library for the territory, with books traveling by train between settlements, bringing education and literature to communities too small for permanent libraries. The new shipment has first editions of Treasure Island and Huckleberry Finn, Delilah told Wyatt. Plus a dozen primers for the Sanderson settlement. They've just opened their first school. Pride shone in Wyatt's eyes. You've done a remarkable thing, you know. 3 years ago, half these settlements had no regular access to books. Now look at what you've built. Delilah smiled, still amazed sometimes at how her small idea had grown. We built it together. I couldn't have done it without your support. It was true. Wyatt had encouraged her from the first tentative suggestion, helping her draft proposals to publishers, building bookshelves for the Circleville schoolhouse, even riding to distant settlements himself during the project's early days when the train service was less reliable. The Evans Ranch had prospered too, expanding beyond the original Johnson land to include one of the most successful breeding operations in the territory. They had built a proper house 3 years ago, with room for their growing family and the dozens of books that continued to arrive from Delilah's eastern contacts. A distant whistle announced the train's approach at last. The children bounced with excitement as the Frontier mail pulled into the station, steam billowing around the platform. "Papa, lift me up," Elinor demanded. "I want to see the mail car," Wyatt obliged, hoisting her onto his shoulders while still balancing Thomas on his hip. Delilah watched them, her heart full of love for this man who had kept every promise, who had built a life with her beyond anything she could have imagined that day 5 years ago when she'd stood on this same platform, clutching a letter and waiting for a train that was running late. As the first crates of books were unloaded, Delilah moved forward to supervise, organizing the local volunteers who would help sort and distribute the precious cargo. Wyatt kept the children entertained nearby, telling them stories about the adventures the books had been on to reach them. Later, as they rode home in the wagon piled with their share of the library shipment, Elinor and Thomas half asleep among the crates, Wyatt reached for Delilah's hand. "Happy?" he asked simply, the question that had become a ritual between them. Delilah squeezed his hand, looking out at the land that had become home at their children, at the life they had built together all because of a delayed train, a letter, and a cowboy's simple note. "Completely," she replied, the answer that had never changed and never would. "Completely happy." The Evans home glowed with lamplight as they approached, visible for miles across the valley, a beacon, a destination, a promise fulfilled. Inside those walls lay their past, preserved in a box of letters tied with ribbon, and their future, embodied in their children and in all the dreams they continued to build together. As Wyatt lifted the sleeping children from the wagon and Delilah gathered an armful of books, they exchanged a look of perfect understanding. This was what they had found in each other, not just love, but purpose, partnership, and the abiding certainty that some journeys, however delayed, lead exactly where they're meant to.